Okay, this is the first of a series of 3 lectures on oil in the Middle East. And in particular, we're going to talk about some of the challenges as well as some possible solutions to uh, the existence of massive oil reserves in some of the countries of the Middle East. But first, before we talk about that, let's talk about measuring oil wealth. So, oil countries are rich, right? Well, not necessarily. If you have a large population, then that oil revenue can be spread pretty thinly across that large population. Hence, the way in which Camet and others classify countries in the Middle East by resources relative to population size, right? That's the, resource poor, labor abundant classification, right? RPLA versus resource poor, labor poor, RPLP, all that classification, which seems like silly work, but it helps characterize some important features of the economy, which is to say the amount of oil wealth relative to the population in that country, relative to the labor force. Now, who owns the oil affects how the revenue from that oil is distributed among the population, right? Is the oil owned by domestic private corporations, like in the United States, foreign private companies, like in Kazakhstan, a national oil company, which does its own extracting, like the United Arab Emirates, or a national oil company that forms partnerships with foreign companies and subcontracts the work to foreign drillers, like Saudi Arabia. The fact that the fact that the country receives more income doesn't always say a lot about the welfare of the average citizen. The GDP could go up, but the fate of the average citizen could not be much affected by this fact. Two countries where this seems particularly salient, although not in the Middle East, is something like Equatorial Guinea, right, where the dictator Theodore Obiang essentially arrogates all of the oil wealth of his country for himself, and leaves his population fairly poor. So if a country is wealthy, that's also not the same as having access to a lot of income, or having a lot of purchasing power, or having a lot of capital. So we're going to have to do some work to disentangle all of these things. I think oil is best understood as an illiquid, non-renewable stock. What does that mean? Well, illiquid here means that it's not easy, that is to say it's either costly or time-consuming, to transfer oil from under the ground or under the sea into cash. Oil in that sense is like fine art or wine or ownership in a small business. It's not easy to convert to cash. It's not always easy to convert into cash because you have to extract it, because you have to you have to discover it first, and then you have to extract it. So having a lot of it is not the same thing as being able to sell it. Also, you can't sell it all at once, right? Saudi Arabia has a lot of oil reserves, but it can only extract a certain amount of oil per year. It's also a non-renewable stock, which means it's a finite amount. Once the oil is extracted, it's gone. Right? And this is opposite of other kinds of natural resources that are renewable and that are flows, like a river, right? Powering a hydroelectric dam. The electricity from the hydroelectric dam is, for all purposes, intents and purposes, a renewable resource because the river keeps on flowing, which keeps the turbines turning, which keeps the electricity flowing, right? That's renewable. The oil, once it's gone, is gone. And so oil is very much unlike other streams of revenue that just keep on going. Okay, what do these facts about oil, that it's an illiquid, non-renewable stock, imply when we're analyzing oil wealth? Well, it means that selling oil is less like receiving income from a job than like selling stock from your IRA and putting it into your checking account. Right? By selling oil, all countries are doing are rearranging their assets in a more convenient form, not necessarily getting richer. Now, their GDP statistics will be more attractive the more oil they sell in a given year. But note that the oil is in the ground whether they sell it or not. And so in that sense, it's more like converting money from your savings account to your checking account or to cash than it is creating new income. What this means is that the GDP statistics that you have, gross domestic product statistics, which measure the total income for a country in a given year, GDP statistics for oil-rich countries don't quite mean the same thing as GDP statistics for economies that have comparable GDPs that make their money through other commercial means or industrial means. U.S. GDP is largely a reflection of technological, human, and physical capital that can both reproduce itself and even improve itself over time. Right? Where Saudi Arabian GDP is for the most part a reflection of its ability or desire to sell a finite resources. In other words, the clock is running out on Saudi Arabia's ability to produce phenomenally high GDPs, whereas the clock is not necessarily running out on America's ability to produce GDP, because America's ability depends largely on technology, human capital, let's say education, factories, know-how, organization. These are forms of capital that can renew themselves much more easily than oil. So are oil countries rich? Back to our original question. Well, in one sense, they can undeniably create large streams of revenue from the sale of their oil. So undeniably, oil countries can appear rich and can achieve high levels of consumption, as well as high and improving levels of healthcare, education, and so on and so forth. In another sense, though, how rich these oil countries are in the long term will depend on what they do with their oil sales, right? That is to say that if they use those oil sales wisely, rather than spend it on fine watches and fast sports cars, if they invest it wisely, they can continue to produce streams of revenue far into the future. So if Saudi Arabia wants to ensure that it permanently remains a rich country rather than being a temporarily rich country, and by the way, we can think of other temporarily rich parts of the world that are no longer rich. I want to give you the example of Caribbean islands. During the 1700s. Caribbean islands produced fantastic amounts of wealth through the sugar trade. Caribbean plantations produced lots and lots of sugar, which was a very highly desired and highly scarce commodity in the 1700s for export, and thus got very, very rich. In fact, more people wanted to go to the Bahamas and Jamaica than wanted to go to Virginia or Massachusetts to colonize in the 1700s. If you were a betting man or woman, you would want to go to those colonies rather than to the harsher tobacco exporting colonies of the United States. That being said, the sugar boom crashed. The desirability of sugar crashed. It became easier to produce sugar in different ways through beets and other technologies, and so sugar became less valuable over time, and so the Bahamas and Jamaica became less attractive. Conversely, the United States grew to a world power. So if the Saudis want to ensure that they permanently remain a rich country, they're going to have to find ways to transform the proceeds from its oil sales into assets that are capable of producing streams of revenue into the future, right? And the Saudis started doing this. They have to buy property and businesses in the West. They also have to heavily invest in human capital by sending their brightest students to receive first world education abroad, as well as create new world-class universities at home to, again, increase their human capital, which hopefully will increase their ability to produce revenue in the future. They were also going to try and develop their local economies by investing in Saudi businesses. Saudis have very strong construction and telecommunications businesses, have invested widely in telecommunications. All of those things have been made possible and are attempts to convert a non-sustainable source of revenue, oil, into a sustainable one, or multiple sustainable ones. Okay, so that's all I have on measuring oil wealth, but I think the key point here is that oil countries are living on borrowed time. Oil-rich countries have a shelf life in terms of how much income they can generate from oil under the ground, and therefore how rich they are or rather their sources of revenue aren't really comparable to the sources of revenue in other parts of the world, in the first world countries.